guys, and welcome to another episode of Renewed Minds. It's my great pleasure to welcome Jon. So in this episode, we're going to be discussing today. It's going to be on spirituality and narcissism, which I think is going to be a very profound topic, whereby this has obviously come in discussions quite a lot with us in the past, Jon. I'm sure you agree. And I think
absolutely far too much, maybe.
yeah.
I wish we didn't have to talk about it, but it's a big deal, you know. It's a problem.
It is a big deal. It is a big deal. And to be honest, I feel like, was it the end of 2020? Like, we ended the year of the Great Conjunction, or whatever you want to call it. I just believe we're in now an era where there's a lot of spiritual awakening, and it's for people to tap into that awakening and realize what is going on really in the world. Yeah. Because if you're not awakened to that, you just you can be easily led astray as well. So everyone has, no matter what religion they are, they have a responsibility to themselves to, be in touch with their spirituality and connection to the higher power, or however you want to put that. So yeah, I think where we can start off, Jon, is a theme. It was actually something that I discussed recently with some friends before, and it's this notion and theme that usually comes up in the sense that religion should lead you to church. Spirituality should lead you to God. What do you feel about that, Jon? What's your opinion about that?
Well, it's interesting that religion seems to me to be more controlled by man and man's interpretation of spirituality, which may or may not be good. It depends upon a person. It's interesting, most churches, or actually in most situations where religion is involved, you kind of have one person up at the center. And it's interesting what takes place with it, or it can be interesting what takes place with that one person or with that group of inside people as time goes on. That it may or may not be a spiritual endeavor in the long run, which is fascinating to me. You'd said it moments ago, I think, as we were talking offline. The larger the thing gets, the less it seems to be a spiritual endeavor.
Yeah, and I think
it's frightening.
It's quite frightening, and I think it's just, it even goes with just in business. Like, as things get bigger, there's like less control over certain things, and I believe it just opens the doors to like greater corruption and, people just basically going off doing what they want to do. I think even there was a point where when we were discussing offline and stuff, and you mentioned like the notion of like building small churches where there's no like tithes or offerings, they're taking everything is just given to the poor. Do you think that's like realistic in this world we live in now? Like, do you think people can actually rise up to do that?
I do. I still think, if you take a look at the scriptures and you take a hard look at the concept of church, biblically speaking, you're talking about smaller groups of people that met in homes, rather than large institutions that bought land and secured space or rented a building or whatever it might be, and became this business. The only business I think of the church is really to seek and save the lost. And there are no instructions from Jesus on land acquisition. In fact, he seems to say travel light. In the places he does talk about what to take with you, and he's giving the disciples instructions, and it's kind of just the basics. If those kinds of things were important, now arguably they had the temple back then as well, but Jesus was bringing something new, and the early vestiges of Christianity and what was deemed the church were these smaller groups of people who met. It was interactive, it was relational, it was close. I'd argue that it was spiritually intimate as well. People knew what were going on in each other's lives, and as a church gets larger, those things become just impossible by nature of the fact that it's large. I don't know what the statistics are around the world. I think here in the United States, we've tried to adapt a model. There's a Sunday school model that may or may not be successful in some churches. Others have a small group model. And generally speaking, those smaller groups are very poorly attended. I think for small groups in the US, the last statistic I saw was like 20% of the people who go to church are involved in a small group. Where people get to do life on life, where people get to be involved with each other. I don't think the Bible describes or paints church as an anonymous endeavor anywhere. When he talks about the body of Christ, the head has a function, and then there are other parts of the body that may be less seen, but just as valued. And there seems to be this connectivity of the body of Christ, of the people, and if we don't connect, I don't know how you do church. So to me, it's missing in our world, and what we've traded it for are these large organizations. I hate to use the word, or maybe the right word is businesses. A spade's a spade. I mean, it becomes, I understand there is perhaps a business endeavor to most anything, but I don't know that in the church that has to be so. I do think that the idea of house church can work, where people go and they worship together, they seek God together, there's teaching, there's the breaking of bread, there's communion, all of that, absent of the giant structure that we seem to have attached to it for centuries now, and seems to become consistently polluted the larger it gets. So I do think it's possible.
I think it has to come to a point where people have to get that realization that they have to take responsibility for their spiritual life. They can't rely on any pastor to do it for them. He is just a vessel and a guide. He's not God. It's your responsibility to search for that. And I think there's certain cultures and certain places around the world that are quite religious, very religious, but putting that into practice is a different thing. And it comes to a point where, like, you have to be able to practice what you're preaching. It's not just about, doing this, doing that, and just breaking the cycle and the norms. Like, even if you, like you said, house churches or something, for instance, there's nothing wrong in, spending some time to develop a deeper relationship with your God without going to church. And it's almost to the sense that people would do it as if, like, oh, maybe I didn't go to church today, like start feeling guilty, like not seeing a pastor. When you get to that point, it's almost as if you are pleasing man and you're not pleasing God. When you start thinking in that line, and I think it's just something.
I would call it's almost a consumer mentality with respect to church.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with you. It's like a consumer mindset, and it needs to, like you said, almost run like businesses. Shouldn't they even be run almost more like charities? Like, given to the poor, like, okay, what's being done, or is the aim just expansion to be this conglomerate? so to speak.
Well, it's interesting. Even the people we would deem the founding fathers of the church, the disciples were all bivocational. They made their money elsewhere. And Paul was a tent maker. The disciples were fishermen, and they had other occupations where they had done this. And I was in a position where I was in a mega church. The church at the time had roughly 3,000 people in it, and it started when I arrived. It was about 400 to 600, and then 3,000, and building campaigns and all of this other stuff. And finally, I was like, I'm out. And I went and did house church for about 5 years. And I can remember going and getting my day job and doing ministry on the side, and how freeing it felt to not have money or financial decisions polluting the mix. To you're able to make church decisions. You're able to make spiritual decisions uncorrupted by money, and money just went to the poorer endeavors that we had chosen. It was really, part of it was pretty fascinating, and ultimately the church, I think, has fallen. The church, meaning people's understanding of what I think the church is today in our world, is fallen into disrepute. The reputation of it, they're seen as either judgmental or hypocritical, or they are, or accusing people of something that a pastor gets caught doing, and I just don't think people. I don't think people want to go.
It's sad. It really is. And it's shocking what's going on, I think, with what we even discussed off camera as well. But one of the themes I wanted us to discuss is in regards to having that intuition and discernment when one is almost in, not even necessarily a church, just a holy place of worship, like having that discernment to know when there's some sort of spiritual narcissistic abuse that's going on within that space. Is there any sort of like guidance or advice that you would give around that, having that intuition and discernment, Jon, especially with your past experiences as well?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. If we, last time we talked about narcissism, and I think the way, having dealt with a narcissist in life, the way it makes you approach relationships after the narcissist changes your world. It's like your eyes are open and you go, oh my gosh, and next time around you go, I'm going to be a lot more careful when I make a choice. And most of my life, I've been in a situation where I didn't necessarily get to shop for church. Again, consumeristic, shop for churches, right? What a terrible word. And I was interviewing at churches where I was trying to either secure a ministry position or see if God led me to something that I felt called to there. And so I had to make decisions whether or not to be a part of a church and on a leadership team in a relative with a very small window of even knowledge or opportunity. The average person can go really visit a church as long as they want before they kind of sign on the dotted line and decide. I had to go I had to make decisions on a little information, and in a sense, for me, it was kind of like deciding to get married after only a week's time, which is kind of stupid. And I would tell you when looking for a church, if you find one that you're interested in, perhaps you need to take time. Like I would tell you, if you were going to go date again, and you and I have similar histories with respect to narcissistic people in our romantic lives, I as a fact, one of my biggest flaws is I didn't give it enough time to see some of these things. And I think that would be my first piece of advice, I think, for a church, is you need to see a church through a couple of seasons before you decide I've signed on. I think that the church has to be relational. If you go on Sunday and you leave on Sunday and haven't met anybody, there's a problem. And I'm not just talking about the guy at the door who's got a job to go meet you or shake your hand. I mean, ultimately, church should be a relational endeavor. And if you're staring at the backs of the heads of the people in front of you and listening to somebody speak, and that's your only engagement with it, there's a problem.
Yeah.
You can, a lot of churches are doing church online right now. Also, that's especially since COVID. And in the United States here, a lot of the larger churches were doing that anyways. If we've dumbed church down to you listening to a message, then no, I'm sorry, you cannot do church online because it's not interactive. And if that's all it takes to attend church, then why do it? Go get your popcorn, sit in front of the television set and watch your favorite podcast on Sunday morning and be comfortable if you're not going to go interact with anybody. But church is meant to be bigger than that. Church is meant to be life on life. Church is meant to be engaged. People are meant to know what's going on in your life.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's supposed to be a community where people are supposed to be supported. And, whether they're in dire situations and stuff, like it's the people that should be the focus. But I feel like in these situations, and this is a global thing as well, it's almost like there's a worship that's put on the pastor on the pedestal, basically.
No question.
I think
which fits and feeds the narcissistic mentality, right? Because ultimately narcissists they're not looking for your relationship, they're looking for your worship.
Yeah. And control.
Absolutely. And that's what I mean. You've got a guy up front who all eyes are on him, and he's making, or he or she is making all of the decisions. And I think these people can rise to the top. And you wind up following somebody who perhaps is more narcissist than you might originally have thought. And as I was even thinking through it, and I was in ministry professionally for about 25 years. I think it was three. I was trying to think how many pastoral teams I served under. And I could point to three who, looking back now that I understand the narcissistic mindset and the mechanism, three were very clearly narcissists. I mean, malignant narcissists.
Malignant, yeah. I remember you mentioning that, yeah. And that's crazy, because that is, like we were discussing as well. And this is where some people might be naive to this and assuming that, once you're in church, I'm in a safe place. That's actually when you actually need to be more vigilant, because just because you go into the church doesn't mean you're a saint. I mean, like, what?
Yeah.
Lucifer used to sing in heaven, like he was the greatest singer in heaven. And
right.
I think people need to be more like aware of these things that are going on. And that's, like you said, that's part of the issue when there's like, and I think especially when there's so much control by one individual and there's not enough, accountability, so to speak, or a discussion, because at the end of the day, let's put it this way, nobody's perfect. Nobody's a saint. Where's the accountability? You can't just say because you're the head, you just make all the decisions. It shouldn't work like that. And I think these are perhaps maybe other signs to look out for. Maybe when checking, you're not going to be getting spiritual narcissistic abuse
Mhm.
in regards to these situations. But I think that's pretty much something that people need to watch out for as well. Don't you think, Jon?
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that being in a pastoral role lends itself to a kind of the right word is kind of loneliness. We expected our pastors or our pastoral staff to be flawless, and they're just not.
No, it shouldn't be like that.
Excuse me.
It really shouldn't be like
And 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 in that sense of the word, I always felt like it was rather living in a fishbowl, where you were kind of in this little microcosm of a world where everybody was looking in from all sides at you,
yeah.
making judgments about your life, which may or may not be true, and it was very hard to be vulnerable with that same group of people about areas of even simple failure or sin or in. And I think there needed to be. I always felt like there needed to be more of an understanding
Yeah. Oh,
that
definitely.
that
Yeah.
that pastors too are just
Human beings.
sinful human beings like everybody else. And I found myself consistently trying to knock this soapbox out from underneath me, or this pedestal that people wanted to go put me up on. And I was constantly trying to knock that down and go, this is just, I'm just a guy. I happen to have a calling
Flesh and blood.
to go serve, but my that doesn't make me sinless. And
Exactly.
but the position of pastor, I think, can lend itself for sure to that group of people who also want to control, want to abuse authority, lack of empathy, endeavor, and or creating a very selfish endeavor where all eyes are focused on them and they become the object of worship rather than God himself.
Yeah, definitely. Which leads me on to my next point. Like, Jon, have you been in like any situations whereby it's almost like the spiritual narcissistic abuser is using, perhaps we could say, the word of God to kind of like control the people in a manipulative way, in a sense that there's being like twisted, and which I think can be really, really confusing for the abused, because especially if they're not spiritually grounded, which leads back to the point we even mentioned before, it's your responsibility to have that connection. Because if you're just relying on a higher authority to do that for you, it opens yourself up to abuse if you don't know or understand. Because it's not just a book, it's a spiritual book. You can't just read it like an academic book. It doesn't work like that. So it's for people. I think some people find that difficult sometimes to tap into that kind of spiritual connection. So I don't know if maybe you have any like examples of that you can share to help people.
I think the places I've seen it most have been with respect to buildings and creating man-made things versus things that God might embrace. I know here where I live, there were at times millions of dollars poured into buildings or facilities and things like that, and these things painted as very spiritual endeavors. And in my heart, I'm going, man, what could that $10 million do for the poor in the city here? What would that, and manipulating people to give financially, I think is a place where you see that happen an awful lot. I want to hit something you just said that really kind of triggered a thought, and it's you said it in such a way that people don't explore for themselves. They don't read the scriptures themselves, and church is the icing on the cake. It is not the cake itself. The cake is your relationship with God. And the icing on the cake is church. It's meant to go enhance that. And if my understanding of spirituality is just through what God has given some other man, assuming he's paying attention to God, then my view of God is very limited. I've not given God an opportunity to speak to me directly.
Yeah.
I've got no concept of whether or not what is going on in and what the pastor is saying is accurate. And if I don't have that, then there's no I have no real contribution to the body, anyways.
It's true.
So
It's true.
so you have to have this relationship with God yourself, and that is the cake. And it's not the church's responsibility to grow me up. It is my responsibility to grow me up with God, and his responsibility to grow me up with him. And church is meant to enhance that, but ultimately it's my responsibility. People leave all the time because they don't like what a pastor preaches or what a pastor says. And to me, that's ridiculousness. Again, it's ultimately this consumer mentality. The church is just meant to give to me. And Jesus teaches differently. He says, for the Son of Man has come to serve, not to be served,
very important,
and to give his life as a ransom for many. So church, when you evaluate a church, you want that to be the place you're going to be able to go pour in. It's not just you taking out. If everybody takes out, the group is exhausted immediately. If everybody focuses on giving, then the church has resources, spiritual, financial, whatever it might be, to go help the world. And that's the way it should be.
And just on that point that you made, Jon, like I like that point, because at the end of the day, it brings back to that point I made about accountability. At the end of the day, if you're studying it for yourself, you should be empowered to know, and linking back to your intuition, if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing spiritually, you should be able to challenge when you're seeing maybe traits of going towards controlling narcissistic tendencies, and to be able to question that, because I believe it's actually there should be some form of accountability within that the institution of the church, and you should be able to have that courage to speak up and ask things, why things being done like that, because like you said, you should be a contributor as well to the church, and not just just going there to take. And a brilliant point that you made about just didn't like what the pastor says and then leaving, then it's like, is it just an entertainment or something like that? Because let's put it that way, some people go based on the likability of the pastor. Can they amuse them? Can they make them laugh and stuff? So I think,
when somebody speaks that, it says more about their character than anything else. It says that I'm here to take. It says I'm not here to give, and my focus is on one person. And involvement in the church is not just with that one guy that is not even making eye contact with you on Sunday morning. That's not participating in church. Participating in church is a relational endeavor. It should last beyond pastors. And you should be committed to a group of not just the Lord himself, but a group of people who know you and who you seek to know, that you want to be involved with in life. And I hate to say it, but the non-religious world does it better.
Honestly, it's a brilliant.
If you go back to the if you go back to the 90s and the movie Sister Act, Whoopi Goldberg says, people want to go to a bar, but they don't want to go to church. And part of that, a big part of that is the relational endeavor, that the relational dynamic that takes place in a bar. It's easy to find a friend in a bar, and it's not easy to find a friend in a church. And that's backwards of what it should be.
That is so profound, mate. That is so profound and deep and sad in a way at the same time. Like it's crazy. It should be the other way around, but it's just this is where people need to get enlightened and have a renewed mind when it comes to all these issues within spirituality and narcissism, so to speak, which even leads me on to a point whereby, like, do you think also maybe one of the signs also to watch out for this spiritual narcissism in these areas is when maybe your opinions I don't know if you've got any relation to that. If your opinions are not taken on board and there's a demand for like total submission to their authority, and you cannot question that, I mean, surely that should be like a sign to watch out for when, if you are trying to exercise that, okay, let me ask some things in terms of accountability within the church. But if it's always like, boom, 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 you're in the wrong, do not, you know? But I also feel like the way this can be like done in such a manipulative way that it might be not so easy to see. I don't know if maybe you have relatable experiences like that.
I do. The last church I served in full time, the pastor was very, very much like that. In fact, I'd consider him by modern definition, a narcissistic bully. He was always looking for somebody to pick on. He was controlling in people's lives. He was not open to being questioned. He was lying. He was manipulative. I can remember, and the church only had 250 people in it. Now, mind you, I've been in a church of 3,000, so 250 was a lot smaller in an environment. And he said, "Hey, we're going to have an elders meetings." When I first got to the church, I said, "So," and I said, "Well," I said, "I got a kid's birthday tonight, so can I come to the next one, because it's important that I make my kid's birthday party?" And he said, "Oh no, we skip birthday parties for that." And I told him I didn't. and after telling me his church was family friendly, and I tried to negotiate something where I could kind of do both, and that didn't work. So I wound up having to go to this elders meeting because it was forced. And I asked him, I said, "Well, how long are these elders meetings?" And he said, 3.5, 4 hours long. And I said, I just started laughing, and I go, "No, really?" I said, "How long are these meetings?" And he goes, 3.5 to 4 hours long. And I went, "What? We got 250 people. What is there to talk about?" And when I got to this meeting, it was the group of elders, and perhaps there were 12 of them, and the pastoral staff and the pastor. And it was basically the pastor just talking, and he enjoyed listening to himself. And there were constantly people on church discipline. He was prying into the lives of people to look for ways to put them on church discipline, in order to remove them from the church in the long run. And his little tentacles were in absolutely everything. He was the most controlling person I'd ever known. And ultimately, after having served in a church for almost 10 years, I lasted 5 months in that, and I said, "Have a nice day." So, and constantly looking for ways to manipulate people. One of the things that I learned also about this mechanism, and particularly with him, is that he surrounded himself with younger men who were right out of college so that he could disciple them. And because they had no ministry experience, there was no way for them to challenge his word. And if you did challenge him, you were essentially blackballed or excommunicated in a sense from the church. And he didn't appreciate those kinds of things. It was ridiculous. I mean, he was excommunicating people for minor things. But he was completely not open to. They are. So if you've got somebody around you, I mean, it's this one older guy who's got basically guys right out of college around him who don't know any better. And again, no reason to challenge it because they've not seen anything else. I came in with a ministry background, and I can remember telling him one day, I said, I served in 6 churches and this would be my 7th. And everything here is upside down. If I take those other 6 churches, there's 60 to 80% commonality in the way things are done and the way we approach things. And this church is absolutely upside down of the others. It's 20% commonality, and the other 80%, I don't know what the heck you're doing. And it was consistently like that. And the area that this particular geographic area in the United States had a culture that that churches were hyper conservative. There still is a very hyper conservative group of people there, and those churches are very papal in the word, as in the Pope. You know, they look to one guy to go rescue them and have all of the authority. And again, in the narcissistic mentality, that was, I mean, it fit him very well. Ultimately, the man was removed for indiscretion with somebody, and did not submit to authority in any kind of way, and was removed from the position. And those guys who were younger got an education very quickly on the narcissistic mentality, and pretending, making up stories. You know, these were looking back. I understand it now because of, you know, my romantic experience, my ex-wife, and now I go, oh my gosh, this is what was going on before, and I just didn't realize it. So I've absolutely seen that, and it in the church, and it's hideous.
Yeah, and like you said, I think it's like mentioned before, it's not just romantic relationships. People need to, you know, have a sensitivity to all these kind of things, because it is so common, like workplace, you name it. And especially like your place of worship, you actually need to like be awakened to all these things, because it can just be so easily happening. And I think another thing, like you said before, you need to take time to like monitor where you're going, because I don't believe, unless you're some great prophet or something, to be able to just know always all the time what's going on. You need to take that time to be able to study what is going on, the way things are being done, to be able to make an informed decision. So I think that's really quite important as well.
Unquestionably. And again, there, you know, if you see somebody who's calling all the shots, nobody's questioning their decision making. You see just out and out wrongdoing and deception from the top down. If you get a sense that they're the ones looking for you to worship them versus worshiping God, if they're the only ones ever teaching, and that they don't allow anybody else to teach, they don't want somebody else to share that space. Personally, I think I'd rather if you know, if I were in a large church again, I'd want to be a part of a church where there was a teaching team. And ultimately that was the way I led ministry too, because there were only so many different ways I could communicate the gospel. But and I'm a man also, and perhaps there were women out there that needed to hear from a woman. So I had women on my teaching team. I had other people who would communicate the message of Jesus Christ in ways I could just never do because of my personality, and shouldn't. God's given me a personality. He's given other people a personality, and they can communicate things and reach people, and in places that I was not able to reach into. And I found those kinds of things healthier, and it kept the spotlight off of me. One of the other things I would tell you that I think is the mark of a godly church is a plan to go plant other churches. And you may not be able to make, you know, your viewers may not see the connect with that. Let me draw the lines to it. So ultimately, if a church grows, the favor of God is on it. It's relationally growing. It goes from 100 to 200 to 300 to 500 to 600. And I know in the mega church I served in, I realized after we hit about 600 people, everything we did served one purpose. It was trying to take something that had grown too big and make it feel smaller. So instead of having one pastor, we had a pastor and an associate, and then we separated out the children, and then we separated out the teenagers, and then we separated out middle school and high school, and then we separated out the college students. And you have these to create these pockets of relationship because the thing had grown too big. So ultimately, I think the biblical model of growth is church planting. Is you raise up another leader from within, and you go take part of the church leadership. You plant another church in another community. It is real leadership.
Yeah, you
And
hit
that's one of
home.
the things, here that it's one of the things that frightens me, I think, about the mega churches in our world. You go, well, who's the heir apparent? Who's going to teach next? And if
Yeah,
these churches are built around ego and persona, and
yeah,
there is somebody who's being worshipped at the center,
exactly,
when he's gone, the church is gone. So
exactly.
so to me,
Which,
church
yeah, go on. What were you going to say, John?
to me, church planning is kind of the opposite of that narcissistic controlling mentality. It says,
Yeah,
I'm humble enough to release a group of people to make my church numerically smaller, perhaps even, and have less resources to go fulfill the call of God, to go start another church in another place with another leader.
honestly,
And
yeah.
to be the opposite of controlling in that.
Yeah,
And what narcissists do, and people who are controlling, instead of growing wide, where they would take one church and then separate one out and then separate out another one, they grow it tall,
decentralization.
which
Yeah,
is I'm at the
I'm at
top.
the top. Yeah,
I will, I take all of this stuff and I'm at the top, and those are the
that's spot
dangerous
on.
places. And I think the
Spot
scriptures
on.
give us the model for this, and it is church planning. It's
Yeah,
go and
so
birth another church.
that's spot on. That's spot on, mate. And it's like even the next point I was going to make, when you've got a spiritual narcissistic abuser that's got a high level of social clout, like you said, ego as well, they need that supply to put that mask on. And like you said, if it's going through like that, it's just going to be, and like I said, that intuition is so important, because and this kind of intuition, you don't have to be like, God can use anyone. You don't have to be like some grand master of the the arts of the Bible, or whatever you want to call it. You can be, because I'm saying this from experience as well, where I've been, in much younger, and I've had an intuition about something, about someone in the church, and it's like, and certain things I would register in my head. Certain things would happen, like, okay, if they don't approach me, I'll know they're a fake, maybe it's and then like maybe some things will now come out, or like, this is a true story, some things will now come out on the news about that person, like, who's supposed to be a high level of social clout and ego, like, criminal offenses, which goes to show that intuition I had was correct. So you don't have to be a certain age to know these things. It's just about having that connection. You don't need to have read your spiritual book from beginning to end. It's all about your heart and having that connection with God. Just open up your heart, and to open up your understanding. You don't need to know everything to have like a deep revelation of something. I believe everyone has their own talent. Everyone can be a genius in their own field. So you don't need to be the all-knowing. It's just finding that connection, so you can have that intuition, to have that discernment in these spheres of spiritual narcissism. Because let's face it, John, let's not beat around the bush. This is happening all over, it's all over, and people need to gain an awareness of these issues so that they're not led astray. And I think even earlier today, I was catching up with a friend, and they were even telling me about situations where I almost likened it to, I don't know if you guys in the States are familiar with that game Simon Says, like Simon Says This.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. So it was like, and she was basically telling me that it's just ridiculous, like the way this man was, using the Lord says. So whatever the Lord says through him, you must do. I mean, come on. Like, it goes back to what we were saying about studying that word, because and so many people are being led like that. It's ridiculous. It's It's absolutely ridiculous.
When that church I was telling you about, and during those 5 months I was there, and I just actively prayed for the Lord's direction that entire time on what to go do. And ultimately I can remember approaching him, and the guy who was, again, much younger, who's an associate pastor. And I told him, I said, look, I have to leave. I said, this is not the place for me. There's a call to go plant churches in my life. And as much as I would like to do that here, there's a kind of controllingness you have in this that is just not a part of my heart or my character. And I will never be that. And I know you want me to be. So this is not for me. And I've sought God. I've sought wise counsel in other spiritual mentors, and it's time for me to go. And what the man spoke to me was, he says, first off, you need to understand that if it was time for you to go, God would tell me first before he would tell you, and he would tell me and the elders. He wouldn't tell you. I was like, okay, because I clearly have no connection with God, and you are the Grand Poobah. And he said, and he said to me, he said, look, you have two choices. He dumbed it down to this. He had this thick New York accent, big guy, bully in presence. And he said to me, you have two choices. You can either obey me and stay, or you can disobey me and leave. And he said, if you leave, he said, I will make this the most painful exit from a church in your life. And he said to me, I will give you 2 weeks to think about it. And I said, okay. And I walked out and I picked up my phone right then and I called the movers. And I took those 2 weeks to make all of my preparations and get everything lined up for me to move out of the house that I was in and back to the house I was trying to sell. And 2.5 weeks later, we were gone. And he honored his word and made it the most painful exit of my life, going so far as to mock me and bully me on social media on my timeline. I wound up having to block him because
these are church people. These are church people. So there you go.
This is yep. And he went so far as to call my references back and to tell them what a schmuck I was, because he was so put out that I left.
Wow.
And I mean, that again, that happened. That church is still recovering from him years later, even though he was removed 2 or 3 years ago because of misgivings. That church is still recovering, and I feel for them, because it doesn't just hurt. This isn't confined to the pastoral team. They're real people with real issues, real problems, and when they encounter these people, it is horrific. One of the other things that stands out in my mind was I can remember being in a pastoral staff meeting, and apparently the counseling was getting too much for the pastoral team. So they brought in this guy who was, of course, I was a youth pastor at the time. So they brought in this guy who was in his 80s, and he handed out this document to all of us. And I looked at the document, and it was a book list of all the books that he'd read in the last 2 or 3 years, Wild at Heart and Spiritual Leadership and some others. And he talked about counseling, and we were supposed to vet this guy who was, again, about 80 years old. And of course, in my mind, I'm thinking, all right, I'll have teenagers that have issues, and I'm going to want to send these teens to somebody for counseling or spiritual counsel. So would I send teenagers to this guy.
Yeah.
And the answer after talking to him was a resounding no. I asked him if he'd had any experience with addiction therapy, counseling people who are addicts, and he said no. And I'm like, well, isn't that like 3/4 of counseling? It's addiction. He's like, it is somewhere. There's an addiction, and he goes, yeah, well, I refer that out. And there were a couple of other things I'd asked him that he had no experience with, and the end result of the conversation was there's no way in the world I'd recommend we hire this guy. So I let my voice be known as he was walking out, and after he walked out, I kind of gave the pastor my opinion. But before he walked out, he said to the pastor, he said, "Oh, by the way," he says, "about that form you wanted, that'll be fine," and then left. So I voiced my opinion. I said I would never hire this guy. He'd be a miserable counselor for teenagers. He had no psychological training whatsoever. He just had his little book list. So I know it's crazy. So I said, by the way, I said, what is that form that he was talking about? And the pastor said, oh, well, it's a form that every person that gets counseled will sign that waives their right to privacy, and the counselor is going to tell us as pastors everything that goes on in those counseling sessions. And I said, I'm out. I said, I don't want my name on that. I said, in order for counseling to work, there needs to be a safe place, and I don't want to know what goes on in those sessions. Part of somebody's spiritual growth, if they want to talk about something particular, they're welcome to come and talk to me about that in private, or confide in me. But admission is and telling other people about what's going on in your life is part of that, and therapy is the first step. But he was so controlling. He wanted to know absolutely everything that was spoken in those counseling sessions, and ultimately so he could manipulate or use it against people after they'd gone to see somebody for help. So there's plenty of that around. And again, and you know, we're sitting here talking. They're genuine, God-loving religious leaders out there too, who are humble, who are empathetic, who are caring,
Honestly,
who are God-loving, who
that even leads me to the next point. That leads me to the next point I wanted to mention, and it's on church, the humility, you know, and especially perhaps a church admitting when they've even made a mistake or even misjudged the character of someone, you know, perhaps in their midst or something. I think that can actually be incredibly difficult for them, because being supposed to be like this institution of trust for guidance on worship, but it's necessary though to actually be able to see that these people are being empathetic, they're admitting that they're also human and they can also make mistakes. And like you said, you know, it's having that humility, you know, to be able to see that and convey that to people. And it's also godly as well, to put it that way. So I think, like you said, I think most of the themes out of this is being very controlling, having so much control, even to the point sometimes whereby there might be groups set up that, you know, you can't like function outside the realm of church's control of meeting. I think that's just ridiculous, you know, if there's instances like that. So we've got to be aware of this and, you know, be able to also challenge, like we say, and if the church is not humble enough to admit wrong, then I think that's another bad sign to watch out for. Definitely.
Yeah, there's and you know, I think it goes back to, I really do think it goes back to what I think the Lord requires of us, and you know, humility, not sacrifice, right? I think that it's, the Lord understands a lack of perfection, but the humility to to humble yourself and to repent and to ask forgiveness is another thing entirely. And quite honestly, that paints the right picture, and it gives the right vibe to church, which is this is not a perfect endeavor.
Exactly.
It's a God endeavor, and it uses human people, but to repent when you have failed is the ultimate mark, I think, of humility and that humble spirit. There's a guy at the gym who's a good friend of mine.
Yeah.
Some friends of mine and I play trivia every Wednesday night, and I'd asked him on Monday if he'd wanted to go, and we lose all the time. My team name is Low Expectations. So and if we're playing badly, by the end of the night we're No Expectations. But I'd invited him out on Monday. We play on Wednesday night, and he said he wanted to go. So I was expecting him. We had a chair for him, and I texted him the location on Wednesday morning, and I didn't hear back. And no show, no call. And I'm like, man, that's sad. I really thought he's going to come. I'm a little disappointed. And the very next day I saw him at the gym, and he made a beeline for me and said, I just want you to know, I am so sorry. I completely let you down. I didn't text you. I didn't call you. I was at work and I was stuck. And there were several times where I thought I need to call him or I need to text him and tell him I'm not going to be able to come. But I'd get distracted with what I was doing, and I had to work overtime, and I apologize. And I, of course, said, look, it's okay. I mean, I extended forgiveness and apology accepted. He kept going. He's like, no, man, you deserve a better friend. And I said, well, I just appreciate the fact that you were humble enough and honest enough to come and apologize. And I thought, and I walked away from that encounter, and I thought, that's the kind of guy I want as a friend, right there. Who's humble enough to say, look, I made a commitment, I didn't honor it, and I need to humble myself before you, honestly and sincerely. And I could tell that he was in that space. And those are the kind of people you want to. I think the same applies to church. Those are the kind of people you want to run with. Those are the kind of people that you'll ultimately find safe and want to share your own life with. The Lord really does give us discernment. You have the word right. It's in unspiritual terms, it's your gut feeling. What does your gut feeling tell you about?
What does your gut feeling tell you?
This place that you're about to go engage with? And everyone does have it. Absolutely. It's even a spiritual gift. The Bible talks about that. Some people have like this gift where they can kind of determine between spirits. It's a spirit of discernment.
Yeah.
And
definitely right
they get impressions or feelings. But there's a lot here to look for, I think, before you connect yourself with a spiritual body, and maybe it does really take a longer time rather than a shorter time to find a place that religiously you might call home.
Definitely.
I think, interestingly enough, also, I think one of the things that you can learn from is if you know of a situation where there are a couple of people in the church or the religious institution that are narcissistic, and you watch how the leadership team deals with some of those people, that can also teach you a lot about who they are.
Okay. Like treat them in what sense then, to be able to teach you about how they are?
Yeah, well, I'll lead by example. I mean, when the church I was serving in, or the church I was attending, when I divorced my ex, who is a covert narcissist, and I'd sought counsel with the pastor, and one of her rarer moments, he had, after about an hour's worth of counsel, he had enough insight to to ask her, she point blank, he said, did you ever love your husband? She goes,
Okay, that one was in the church. Okay, yeah.
no, not really. And that was apparently not a there's no offense in that for her, and no consequences in that for her whatsoever. In fact, it was overlooked. But I was pulled from leadership because I, quote, hadn't done everything I could do to lead my family. When I brought this woman to counsel, countless therapists and counselors, I'd sought wise counsel with other pastors. I couldn't tell you, I mean, after decades and I was exhausted of options. So I wouldn't have known what else to go do. And they didn't have any other suggestions for me either. It was just, because you're the head of the household, you're not leading the way you should because apparently this isn't fixed. And like, I'm supposed to fix the fact that somebody else doesn't love and never did. So when you see that kind of mechanism being given a pass to, ultimately, when they found out I was divorcing, I got an email that said, you are in sin. An email, not a phone call, by the way. And the offices are only 3 miles down the street. So it's not like they couldn't have shown up at my door or picked up the phone to call me, but it basically said, you are in sin. And we would like to meet with you to read you the scriptures that tell you you're in sin, and with the hopes that you will go back to your wife. And I responded. My response was essentially, if you would like to sit down with me to have a conversation about what's taking place before reserving judgment, I would be happy to go do that. And we can have a conversation about these things. And if after that you tell me, I'm supposed to go back, I will consider it, but I would like for you to listen. And what I got back was the same email. We're not ready. We don't want to listen. You're gonna listen to us. Here's the scriptures. You're in sin. You need to go do this. That was what you get. And because the Lord said, right? without ever. What's crazy is they didn't ever even have a conversation with me. She could have been off with God knows who, and been, doing whatever, and they would never have even had the conversation enough with me to even determine what the situation was, and chose not to. They didn't even bother to investigate. So you can tell in leadership whether it's godly or not, because you see an openness to understand. You see a questioning heart. You see people that question themselves. You see a lack of arrogance. You see empathy for the hurting. And if those things are absent, then it's find another place. Whether it's, and let me say this too, whether it's a big box church where you attend a small group, or whether it's a group of people you meet with and do life on life. I could almost argue biblically that if you and I and 3 other guys sat down and spent some time studying the word together, worshiping together, that's more church, the biblical concept of church, than perhaps most people go through on a Sunday morning. So there are definitely marks. I mean, there are things you can be aware of going in, and you can understand and can help you discern whether or not it's something you need to be a part of.
Definitely spot on with that, Jon. Spot on. On the final note, I know we mentioned this before briefly, in terms of like the religion being used as an authority for perhaps personal and financial benefit, because that is a form of abuse of the religion to take.
Absolutely.
I think you mentioned the buildings, or so, like using the building funds or something. I don't know if there's perhaps any other example we can just briefly just explore for people to be a bit more enlightened to these kind of situations, to recognize that, this is, financial taking advantage of them, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think again, these things are understood from the scriptures, and what I would say is people need to go read them for themselves and see what Jesus wanted the church to go spend money on versus what we're spending money on. And well, I'm not an anti-building person necessarily. A lot of churches, as we call them in our day, are doing these giant building campaigns, and they build these monstrosities that sit empty 6.5 days a week, with absolutely no other purpose other than a meeting room or a gathering for Sunday mornings. And you need to look at what they're doing to take care of the poor. What are they doing to take care of the marginalized? There was a church I was a part of some years ago who would spend all this money to go to Africa, and I think it was like $2,500 a head for a week and a half mission trip. And it was, and the people in the mission trip had to go raise their money and support the project. And I can remember the team coming back and reporting in and saying, one of the ladies was just bleeding, and she said it was so hard to see. We went to this orphanage, and we went to this school, and the schools they were dirt floors, and they didn't have anything, and they didn't have diapers for the babies, and went on to describe the poverty. And what we brought were Bibles and essentially a tour. These people, some of the missionaries locally and I didn't go on this trip, by the way, I say us, but because I was a part of the church at the time, but they took the people that went on this tour, and they met people, and they would share the gospel. But at the same time, this orphanage needed diapers, and we spent $2,500 a person to get that team of 20 people out there. And I did the math in my head, and I go, it's $80,000 spent just to get our team back and forth. And what did we leave behind? We left poverty. And my heart broke. It's like, what are we doing for these? What are we doing for these people? We spent money on ourselves to go visit what's going on in another country, and we left that country in the same exact condition as when we got there. We didn't do anything to meet the physical needs of these people. Surely Jesus would have done that. And if those are the kinds of things you're seeing too, it's an absence of even paying attention to the physical needs of the people around you. Like, again, it's just not the right place, and it winds up, I think, being financial abuse. You have to pay attention to those kinds of things as well. And if money is the center of everything, it's gone from being a church to being a business. I watched an episode of television this morning. It was a show called Boston Legal. I don't know if you've ever seen it. If you haven't, it's the best and the worst of humanity all wrapped up in one show. And it's a law, it's an American law kind of TV show. And one of the main characters says, in order for evil to win, all it takes is for good people to be a part of a business. I thought, if that doesn't describe the church in places, where the quote would normally be for good people to sit back and do nothing. Being a business, I think, can be the enemy of the church. And as they grow larger, they become more of a business than you're making decisions more based on money, I think, than you are on spiritual things and on spiritual principles. Well, and that's why I think church personally should stay small. Plant another church, keep it small. Plant another church, keep it small. Plant another church, keep it small. There's plenty of room to grow in other ways.
Yeah, I totally agree, because there's only so much you can do once it gets to a certain size, and it becomes much more difficult to control, because people will be people at the end of the day. And narcissism will still exist. So it's all about managing yourself, your emotions, because it's something that we're going to have to deal with in everyday life, whether it's the workplace or in church or in romantic relationships or even friendships. So that's brilliant. I just want to thank you so much, Jon, for coming on the show.
My pleasure. So good to see you again.
Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that episode with Jon Mckenney, seeing Jon in the live finally. Hope we were enlightened to also discover a lot of topics which we discussed in regards to spiritual narcissism within, like, you know, holy places of worship, especially the church. Hope it's able to give you a lot of education to also protecting yourself, recognizing the signs, because as we discovered from what we talked about, a lot of the themes were control and also having that ability to have that connection to God, to be able to discover the word for yourself and have that intuition and confidence and courage to be able to challenge things that once you start seeing narcissistic, you know, signs and traits, because at the end of the day, you're responsible for your spiritual life and person, because you're a spiritual being and you should take care of yourself mentally and have a renewed mind. So thank you so much for watching. Do hit the like, subscribe and notification bell down below if you're not already subscribed. Thank you so much for the support, and let your comments be known down below. If there are any questions or anything, do let me know. And as I say, I'll see you on the next episode of The Renewed Minds. Thanks for watching. Peace out.